Hi, I'm Seb and I make stuff. This week's build is inspired by one of the most classic video games to ever grace our screens, Crash Bandicoot. You see, I wanted some kind of terrain for a jungle obstacle, but I didn't know what I wanted to build. And I just kept coming back to those early levels of the first Crash Bandicoot game, smashing crates, killing giant carnivorous plants, and trying to jump over and avoid all of those rolling stones. So I thought, what better than building a little Crash Bandicoot diorama to pay homage to this classic game, while also being able to throw down a nice little jungle obstacle that's sure to evoke a whole heap of nostalgia for all of the players at my table. So I jumped onto Google to have a look for some reference images. Straight away I noticed that the old version and the new remastered version have a few differences. They've made some creative choices in the remaster to add a whole lot of more jungle elements. So I'm going to steal some elements from the new design and take a lot from the classic to merge together into something that I think represents what I want on the table. So now that I've picked what I like, I'm going to jump over to Thingiverse and see what models I can find. So unfortunately they didn't have a lot of what I wanted on Thingiverse. I did get a couple of models of Crash and a few different crates, but they didn't have any enemies or decoration. Additionally, I used a heap of plants that I got from a Kickstarter. All of the links to these will be in the description. Now that I had everything rounded up, it was time to throw it onto the 3D printer and get my bits and pieces primed and ready to paint. So I start with the classic Fiddly Bits grey primer, and then I hit them all with a layer of Wraithbone white before moving on to the foam carving. Essentially, I'm just taking a rectangular piece and adding some raised walls to make it look like a section of the classic game. Now it's time to cut out those drops and add this section for the rolling stone. To try and add a little bit of forced perspective, I made these back pieces a little bit more narrow and then moving on to the section of rolling stone. So I carved out this path and then got to carving in the details. Starting off with a scalpel to cut in shape and then coming back with a pen to widen up all of the gaps. Going over the entire thing, adding a brick pattern to both sides. Then moving on to the rolling stone itself. So we're going to do our best to cut a circle out of the foam. There are probably better ways to do this, but I decided to hack it up and do it my way, which left me with a nice rough looking stone obstacle for the middle of my piece. Now to carve out a few of the extra details like the game itself has, and carve in a few of these faces, which took a lot longer than expected, and you kind of can't see them in the final result anyway. But with that, our piece is finally starting to come together, putting the actual obstacle in our trap for our diorama piece. Now it's time to start hot gluing everything together to get our basic shape ready to build up on. And once that's all together, I start running a lighter over everything just to help seal the foam and add a little bit more of an uneven texture. Doing this in a far more extreme manner over anywhere that's going to be a natural earth. Then coming in with some glue, making sure to get it right into the corners before spreading it out over all of the flat areas and adding in a heap of sand for texture. Then repeating this over all of the other flat surfaces. I used white gesso to seal the centerpiece and some matte Mod Podge to seal all of the other foam, before taking them outside and giving them a prime in a Fiddly Bits grey primer, and then a Zenithal style highlight using Wraithbone white. After all that had a chance to dry, I came in with a basic cheap black to try and add the concept of depth and darkness to the whole. Now that the undercoat was done, I grabbed some cheap brown craft paints and started adding a whole heap of base colors onto the earth. And then using a Gorgrunter Fur contrast paint by Citadel to paint the other major stone details. And giving all the plants a base in the contrast Militarum Green by Citadel, before highlighting with a Mood Green, and then adding some colours to these mushrooms. Making sure not to forget those tiny white dots. Then adding some static grass using a static grass applicator, removing all the excess, and coming in with a Tamiya soil effects to really help separate the earth from the muddy sections around it. I also used this to dry brush some highlights over all of the stone textures, really bringing them out and giving them a nice pop. Speaking of pop, it was time to paint the TNT. This got a contrast fleshed hair as red over the entire thing, some black borders, and then I came in with some flashed Gits yellow for all of the highlights. So the original plan was to cover all of the edges of this with a black cardboard or chipboard, but essentially I don't have any on hand and I wanted to get this video done. So for now, it's just gonna get painted with that same cheap craft brown paint that I used on the dirt base. And finally, gluing all of the pieces together using hot glue. And now to start super gluing down all of these extra details. So we stick down all of the plants one by one, trying to randomly lay them out in a way that looks best. Using super glue and accelerant to help hold everything down a little bit quicker, and coming in with a few different variations of plants to add that nice natural difference. And then finally gluing down these little white and red mushrooms that give a nice extra pop of different color. Before moving on to paint Crash himself. I started with a contrast orange by Citadel, then used that same fleshed hair as red from earlier for his hair, gloves and shoes. Coming in with a blue for his jeans, and Citadel's technical waystone green to make for some nice shiny eyes. Then giving some of the final details with light browns, whites and the blacks of the eyes. I also found this Crash Bandicoot sign, which I thought could be a bit of fun when it's on display. So we'll throw down all of the pieces and see what our final build looks like. And now this turned out perfectly. I had the most nostalgic diorama and piece of terrain to throw down on the table to really bring back some of those early gaming memories to all of my players. This was a lot of fun, and I think I'm going to continue these kinds of builds, making terrain pieces that double as dioramas that are inspired by classic video games. I want to do some more from Crash Bandicoot, maybe Spyro, and if there's any other games that you guys would like to see me build, let me know in the comments below. And remember, never stop making stuff.
What have I got?